Where do investors go for insight into companies and their leaders? To Vanity Fair? Not likely. Yet that's exactly where investors should consider going to. There, you will find insights from our next guest. Insights into companies like Microsoft and Tesla, into leaders like Bill Gates and Satya Nadella and Elon Musk. Her Twitter account describes Bethany McLean as a journalist and co-author of several books on business gone wrong, including The Smartest Guys in the Room, The Rise and Spectacular Fall of Enron, All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis, and Saudi America, The Truth About Fracking and How It's Changing the World. Bethany, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Can you give us a little bit of a background, because you really have quite an interesting background in terms of the work that you have done in the past and at present that you're doing?
I suppose I have a bit of an unconventional background for a journalist, or at least I certainly did. I think they're more of me now. But I worked in banking right out of college, actually. I didn't go into journalism. And I was a math major as an undergrad, a math and English major, which is how I ended up in investment banking. But I wasn't a kid with a defined path in life, and so I stumbled into a banking job, and after 3 years of doing that, decided that really I'd always wanted to write about business. And so I joined Fortune back in 1995, which is scary to think that I've had an almost 25-year career covering business. I like to say almost 25 years instead of a quarter of a century. The 25 years just sounds a little bit better.
Very good. And it isn't just business that you cover, because you do cover other topics too.
I do, although most things do have a connection to money somehow. I mean, business writ large is a really, really, really big topic. And a lot of things slot under the topic of business writ large, right?
True. Exactly. Now, in 2014, in Vanity Fair, you wrote a piece about Microsoft. And I kind of want to get into that a little bit, because your timing for the article was about as prescient as it could be. Stock shortly after that did extremely well. Prior to that, to some degree, was not so much. What brought you to Microsoft, and why did you want to do that story at that time?
So it honestly began as a personality story. A very well-placed source who was off the record had told me that Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer weren't speaking anymore, and that they were in a feud. And so it began as me trying to figure out what had gone wrong between Gates and Ballmer. And as part of the process of understanding that, I had to understand Microsoft. And as part of the process of understanding Microsoft, I had to understand who Satya Nadella was as the leader. And at the time, as you know, the sentiment on Microsoft was incredibly negative. This was a company that was, people thought crash and burn, right? And it was really clear in getting to know the company and getting to know Satya Nadella that he was about as bright a future as they could have, that he was going to be a very different leader. So the tenor of the piece ended up shifting from being a piece about the past, about Ballmer's arguable failings as CEO, and about the falling out between him and Gates, which is part of the story. But it ended up shifting to having a forward emphasis, too, on Satya Nadella, in contrast to both Gates and Ballmer.
Now, it's interesting because the story took on, as you describe it, a very different direction from where you started. And yet, if at the time I was reading the article, I would say, okay, well, this is the person who co-authored this, book on Enron and also the financial crisis, and yet here we go with a story that kind of goes in a dramatically different direction. How did the evolution of that work out? As you're conducting the interviews, as you're speaking with different people, as you're researching it, is that what sort of gets the story to mold in a particular direction that your ear picks up on?
Absolutely. I try to start not knowing anything and not having a point of view, and then let the reporting try to shape my point of view. I think the best stories start with a question rather than with an answer. And so if they start with a question, then you're open to hearing things that may be different than whatever preconceived notions you have. So I suppose it's not fair to say I had a totally open mind. I definitely had a preconceived notion that Microsoft was a company that was in trouble, and that it was Steve Ballmer Ballmer's fault. And in reporting it, I came to have a far more nuanced view of that and view of the mess that Gates and the mistakes that Bill Gates had made and the mess that he had handed over to Ballmer. But I also, I think because I knew so little about the business, was open to learning, and it became very clear that Microsoft got exactly the leader it needed in Satya Nadella. And then the question is, they still had a lot of business issues. What's Warren Buffett's old line about the management team versus the quality of the business? You'd rather have a great management team and a bad business than a great business and a bad management team, right?
Right.
And not that Microsoft's business was bad, but if you talk to people in Silicon Valley, Microsoft was done for. It was the old world. It's interesting how that is proven not to be so true, right?
Sure, exactly. Now, Gates got re-engaged.
He did.
That wouldn't have happened with Ballmer, very likely, would you say?
Well, I think because the relationship between the two of them had become so tense that no, it wouldn't have. And so Satya Nadella becoming CEO was also an opportunity for Gates to start fresh in terms of his involvement in the company.
Now, when you're looking into opportunities, areas, ideas, topics, what is that process like? I mean, is it, from general public reading, or is there something where you go, oh, that looks interesting, and then you want to pursue a particular area?
Well, all of the above. I think to be a journalist, you have to be pretty omnivorous in your interests. You can't just say, well, I'm only interested in this, I'm only interested in that. And so I guess my core motivation is mastery. When I write a story, I want people who really, really know it to read what I've written and say, that's right. And maybe even that's smart, or maybe even at the best that made me think about something that I hadn't thought about before. But the last thing I would want would be to write a piece that people who really, really know it well would say, oh, well, that's wrong, or that's stupid. So that's what I'm trying to avoid at all costs, right? So I rarely write with an investor in mind, because I'm not trying to make a stock call one way or the other. I'm a journalist and not an investor for a reason. I could have taken that path, but I actually don't have much interest in it. I just want to learn the topic, and I want to figure it out as best I can, and figure out what the narrative is. I mean, life is storytelling, right? And so if you can figure out what the right narrative is and then convey that and share it, that's what I'm trying to do.
Now, do you turn to expert subject matter experts for to be
Always.
spot on the areas?
I mean, I talk to everybody who will talk to me is my basic mantra. I'll talk to everybody I can. I'll try to talk to employees. I'll try to talk to former employees. I'll try to talk to the company. I'll try to talk to people who really understand the business. Microsoft was honestly a challenge for me because I've never been a tech writer. And so, I mean, I was as basic as trying to understand the difference between Microsoft Office and the operating system. I mean, I really didn't know. And so I really had to educate myself from scratch. And luckily, over my years in the business, I have a lot of people who are patient with me, who will spend hours on the phone talking through what's going on in the cloud, how does it work, why is this important, so that I feel like I can come away from it and be credible on it.
Your writing style strikes me, and I mean this as a compliment. Your writing style reminds me in a lot of respects of Michael Lewis.
Well, that's a huge compliment, so thank you.
In the sense that the stories read like, or the books or the articles read like like you're in the room, like you're hearing the conversations, that can then lend itself toward a screenwriter coming along and putting together a story for film, that type of thing. Has anyone ever said that to you?
Well, the Enron book that I wrote with my friend and former colleague Peter Elkind became a documentary movie. But I don't write with, I think that's impossible to predict, so I don't write with a screenplay in mind. I try to write whatever the story is.
And she said,
I don't even know when I'm writing if I feel like I have a choice in how I'm telling things. I feel like the story kind of, after I've done all my work, presents itself to me as this is what it is. And I don't know then that there's a whole lot of choice in it. I don't know that I think, well, I could write it this way or I could write it that way. I feel like by the time I've done my work, I feel like this is what it is.
I see.
So I don't know if that makes sense. But.
Okay, no, it makes perfect sense. Now, when it comes to the topics that you explore, and it doesn't have to be bad businesses. It doesn't have to be a problem. But they do make for more interesting stories, don't they?
Well, they do. I mean, I sort of joke that I have this expertise in tales of business gone wrong, and it really is accidental, but it began even before Enron, and to me, I find the human stories behind stories of business gone wrong endlessly interesting, because from a very simple point of view, at least from my old math major point of view, it was, well, if bad things happen, then bad people knowingly did bad acts. That's the way it works, right? And then the more you delve into these over time, the more you discover, no, that's actually not what happened. It's a mixture of self-delusion, maybe a little bit of greed, maybe some ego, maybe some venality, maybe some corruption, but it's this really interesting mixture of very human failings, and it's what makes business tales almost Shakespearean in so many ways. And it's the human nature aspect of this that draws me to stories and keeps me interested in doing this.
Would you ever consider exploring the political arena?
So I have a little bit. I did a piece for Vanity Fair on Jim Comey. That ran a couple of years ago. It was right after, it was while he was still serving as the head of the FBI, before Trump had fired him, in essence, but when there was this huge controversy about what had happened in the election and with his investigation into Hillary Clinton. And it was an interesting story. I'm proud of how it came out, but it definitely made me realize that subject matter expertise is worth something. And what I mean by that is that I didn't know how to evaluate as well. I didn't know how to get to certain people. I didn't know how to evaluate as well what I was being told and what the motives behind people who were telling me things was, because I haven't worked in DC and in politics. Whereas in business, I not only know who I at least want to get to, whether I can or not is another question, but I at least know who I want to talk to, and I understand implicitly what people's motives are and why they might be sharing certain things with me. And it's just the benefits of having done this for a very long time. So I did feel a little bit out in the wilderness, to be honest.
In that regard.
In that regard. And look, politics is amazing and fascinating, but there's no shortage of things to write about in the business world. I always say it proves the old adage that truth is stranger than fiction over and over again. I mean, from Enron to the financial crisis to Elizabeth Holmes to Elon Musk. You can't, to the latest WeWork story with Adam Newman. You cannot make this stuff up. I mean, literally, if somebody told you that they were going to come along and write a screenplay about a guy who was bilking investors to the tune of, what did the number end up being, $30 billion, I don't know why, and it was a Ponzi scheme, and they would be, Hollywood would be like, no, that couldn't happen. And there it was, Bernie Madoff, right? So there's so much richness in the world of business that I've never felt like I'm bored. I need to branch out.
Sure, truth being stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have to have a person? Does there have to be an Elon Musk? Does there have to be a Mr. Nadella? Does it have to be a person at the center of it, or could it be about a given topic? Which is kind of like the little bit of All the Devils Are Here, but
Although that was built around people. I mean, characters work better. They make for more compelling storytelling because they're more relatable. I mean, that said, I've certainly done my share of completely numbers-based pieces. My first story that I wrote about Enron for Fortune, which is what started the book process, was called "Is Enron Overpriced?" And it basically could have been written by a skeptical Wall Street analyst. I mean, it was a just dissection of Enron's balance sheet and cash flow statement. There was no character in that piece other than Enron itself, the company, and its dubious accounting, but it was definitely not a character-driven piece. And some of my other favorite pieces have been very, very quantitative, but I guess as I get older, I am more driven to characters, and certainly writing for Vanity Fair, a hardcore straight-up accounting story is not really going to fly.
Right. Let's go on to Elon Musk, okay? Sure. You get the impression from the article that that this is a guy who's really kind of playing really on the edge, if not over the edge, very, very often. And this story about Solar City involving the governor of New York, the city of Buffalo Billion,
yeah, Buffalo Billions,
dynamic that's there. First, tell us a bit about that story.
So I was, like everybody, always interested in Elon Musk, right? One of my ongoing topics of fascination is the line between a visionary and a fraudster. And I'm actually convinced that they're, in many cases, the same person. And sometimes the visionary just gets lucky and catches the break that the fraudster doesn't, and the fraudster gets caught in the middle. But it takes that same personality type, right? The I'm going to do this even though you say I can't. People say this isn't working, but I'm going to persevere right through it. I think a willingness to break the rules. I think sometimes a willingness not to be totally candid with other people if being candid is going to destroy your dreams. So I'm fascinated by that, and so I've been thinking about Musk for a long time through that lens. Which one is he? Is he both? And I was looking for a way to tell the story, and a longtime source of mine said, "Well, are you paying attention to what's going on in Buffalo?" And I said, "Buffalo? I mean, I didn't know that there was anything in Buffalo."
So there it is again, just like with the Microsoft story. In one direction, you find out along the way, and then it takes you somewhere.
Yes, and so
unexpected.
and so I found it fascinating that people had sort of forgotten about this whole Solar City fiasco. And I think the Solar City story, what I find so interesting about it is that it is very clear evidence to me, not in a legal sense, but in an ethical sense, of Musk's self-dealing, his overpromising and under-delivering, his cavalier use of taxpayer funds. And the facts are not debatable. What you could debate, you could say, if you're a total Tesla believer, you could say, well, yeah, all that's irrelevant. I don't care if you made a mess of Solar City because Tesla's great and SpaceX is great. Or you could say, this is what happened here, and this is relevant, and this is something I should know and understand about this man. But I think also partly because I grew up in a mining town in an economically depressed part of the country. So the idea that's not dissimilar from Buffalo in the sense that it was a town built on the steel industry, and the fact that the hope of $750 million investment from the state of New York and jobs, and not just jobs, as one person said to me, but careers, high-tech careers coming to an area to remake it. I feel the pathos of that and intensely, and it makes me angry that it could have been wasted.
And the political dimension of this, which is, again, the complex area and all of that, is that fertile ground to explore a little bit further?
Well, it's fascinating because despite the fact that taxpayers gave Musk $750 million to build and equip this factory, you as a citizen, and of course I'm not a resident of New York anymore, but you can't get in there. They won't let anybody in, so you can't actually. Despite the fact that it is a gift from taxpayers can't see what's going on there. And the original people who were in charge of building it have all been indicted. It was basically a pay-for-play scandal, and it's been taken over by Empire State Development. And neither they nor the governor's office would even so much as get on the phone with me on the record and explain what was going on there and what their point of view was. It's shut down. And that just begs for more work. And thank goodness after the story ran, in large part, I think more due to the great reporting of a couple of Buffalo reporters, including a guy named Dan Talbach, who did really good work on this. But the state comptroller's office is opening an audit to figure out what's going on with the plant there and how the money is being spent. And so, thank goodness, right?
For sure. I would imagine that an investigative organization or a division, investigative unit of a major news organization, 60 Minutes, are you listening? That perhaps they might.
Well, you can't get in there if Musk won't let you in, right? So all you can do is talk to the former employees, which I did. This is something where I think the press needs to shine light on it, and then the government agencies that can do something about it need to answer the questions.
Now, you did mention in a piece that Solar City could even pose a threat to Elon Musk's entire empire. How do you see that happening?
So I see it in a couple of different ways. One is the lawsuit. Tesla shareholders sued after the acquisition of Solar City, saying that the board was controlled by Musk and that this was essentially self-dealing on Musk's part because he bailed himself and his cousins out of some loans they had made to Solar City.
Excuse me one second. The acquisition was done when?
So it was done in 2016.
16.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a judge allowed the lawsuit to proceed. An unredacted version of the complaint just got filed and made headlines for some of the allegations allegations in it. Depending on what the settlement figure is, Tesla doesn't have a lot of cash on hand, so that's potentially a problem. The bigger problem to me is the reputational one. If one part of Musk's empire fails, and well, let me back up. The other part is that Solar City has unquestionably been a cash drain for Tesla, and this is not a company that it can afford to be losing more cash than it already is. So the acquisition of Solar City has added to the pressure on Tesla's balance sheet, which Tesla would have more breathing room if it weren't for Solar City. A couple of people in the piece, there's a very vocal group of Tesla skeptics and short sellers who are very active on Twitter under the hashtag TeslaQ, which is the stock symbol followed by the Q for bankruptcy. But a lot of them said to me, we wouldn't have gotten interested in Tesla if it weren't for Solar City. But we watched what happened with Solar City and the obvious self-dealing involved in bailing out this failing company. And we said, wait, is Musk a genius, or is he? Is what's going on here? And so it really caused the level of scrutiny of Tesla, the company, to raise to a level that it would not have otherwise.
Have you ever been approached by institutional investors for insight into, let's say, a company or areas or industries that you have done work in? And the reason I bring that up is because if I wanted to get to a better understanding of Tesla, I would want to know more about the head of the company. And you provide that exploration of that.
I haven't. I think I would be wary of saying anything privately that I wouldn't say publicly. I think that just gets into murky terrain.
Okay.
And again, I don't know. I haven't been asked, so I haven't had to think through that. Maybe
Well, you've answered it. Then.
Maybe
You haven't been asked.
maybe it would be perfectly fine. But I think as a journalist, when you write things, what you're willing to say should probably be what you're willing to say publicly, right?
Right. Well, I would think if I were institutional investor, major company, had a position in or was thinking of, or a competitor position, here's a person who has some pretty good insights.
Well, maybe a better way to think about it is because of what I do. If I have an insight, I'm going to share it publicly. I'm not going to have all these great insights that I'm just kind of
Right.
sitting on, right?
Right, yeah. But people who are watching this get a better insight into you beyond, or in addition to reading,
Yeah,
the articles.
that's probably fair.
Yeah. So last area to kind of touch on, what are you working on now? Anything you can give us any insight into?
Nothing super exciting. I launched my own podcast called Making a Killing, where I am actually interviewing other people who have written what I view as great business stories or great business books that I think are really important to do this, to try to get under the surface of the story even more than the writer has. And as you know, probably from doing this, it's a fair amount of work.
Sure.
It's something I really enjoy doing because it makes my world bigger, right? It makes me have to pay attention to other people's stories in a more than cursory way and really dig into them. And as a result, I've read things that I wouldn't have otherwise read, probably, from my friend Catherine Eban's marvelous book, Bottle of Lies, to a book about the opioid crisis that I might not have delved into otherwise. So that's occupying a fair chunk of my time. And then I am actually attempting to write a story about the city I live in, Chicago, which is, I've been told since then that stories about cities have done in many writers, and I understand why, because it is extremely difficult to figure out how to boil something as complicated as Chicago down into a narrative. But that's what's keeping me busy. So it's a different sort of project for me.
And any interest in artificial intelligence?
Just for help in augmenting mine, yes, definitely. No, as a kid, I was fascinated. I grew up without a TV, so all I did was read science fiction, Isaac Asimov in particular. So I'm fascinated by artificial intelligence. I just don't know what the right story is yet.
Sure. Interesting.
Although that one may turn out to be Musk too, if you believe what is his thing, the Neuralink, where he can seamlessly upload something or another. I can't remember what his promises on that particular one are.
Well, it does seem to be the potential of being transformative.
Yes.
You know.
Well, but in a really frightening way, right?
In a frightening way, sure.
As we were talking about earlier, one of the most hopeful things I heard in a while was a conversation that was a while ago between Richard Plepler, who ran HBO, and the head of Instagram. And they both said that they could not predict what made a show go viral or what made a particular image go viral. They didn't know. There was no algorithm for figuring it out. And I thought, thank God, because it's the most hopeful thing I've heard in a long time. Because as long as we remain unpredictable, we're one step ahead of the robots.
Excellent point. And just last area, again, in the tech area, but it's very much in the news, dealing with cybersecurity. Now, here you have publicly traded companies, privately held companies, and government. It's like a nexus of, many, many different dynamics that are there. Is that?
Right. It's totally fertile ground. Again, I haven't found the right story yet, but I don't have I probably should have a more scientific process for deciding what it is that I'm going to pursue next, but I really don't.
Well, it's
I tend to,
organic.
something comes to me and hits me, and I say, oh, that's what I have to do now for whatever reason, and it's more of a gut instinct than it is a process. So sometimes I think, especially as I get older and opportunity cost becomes a bigger issue, that I should have a set of really important things going on in the world and kind of be actively looking for stories in them. But in a way that belies my early experience, because when I wrote about Enron, I didn't think it was going to be a big story. I didn't think it was going to turn into the corporate scandal of the decade. I just thought, wow, this is really interesting. And so since that's worked for me in the past, it's a hard, that sort of gut level, just this is interesting. I haven't really adapted that approach yet.
Well, your instincts have served you extremely well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.